Shalom Aleichem, Likutei Sicha, volume 26, Sicha on Vayakhel, Sicha number 1. Fascinating Rashi Sicha, but the Rebbe uses his signature style of looking at every Rashi in detail. Every single word is nuanced and meant to be. And not only does he explore one Rashi, but in the process, actually, a total of 3 Rashis in this Sicha. So the portion begins, Vayakhel Moshe is called Das B'nai Yisrael. Moshe gathered all the Jews, and he told them. But he's about to tell them the law of the Mishkan. That was his instruction last week. But he first throws in 3 or 4 psukim, the mitzvah of observing Shabbos. 6 days shall you work, 7th day shall you rest, etc., etc. Seems highly out of context. And then it starts the next section, and Moshe told all the Jews, I want you to build a Mishkan, collect money, etc., etc. Says Rashi right there at the beginning of the portion on that verse, 6 days shall you work. Hiktim lahem, he prefaced to them Shabbos restriction before Mishkan construction to teach us that it does not override Shabbos. Here they have this mitzvah to build a Mishkan. Do they or do they not override Shabbos in doing it? It's an important mitzvah. And therefore, no, Shabbos goes first. Moshe prefaced Shabbos first to show them that Shabbos is more important. The Mishkan will not override Shabbos. The Rashi commentaries, who try to analyze Rashi, point out that what is the purpose? What's the intent of this Rashi? What's he talking about? What's the message? Aha! He doesn't just say that he threw Shabbos in next to Mishkan, which seems out of context. Could have said that. It says Hiktim, he prefaced Shabbos restriction before Mishkan, because the principle here is that former overrides the latter in Torah. That when in Torah says 2 things, A and B, and they're one next to the other, A will override B. This is how the commentaries look at it. There is apparently such a concept in Torah that the former will override the latter, and that's Rashi's message, and that's his choice of words. Hiktim lahem, he prefaced Shabbos first before Mishkan construction. So the Rebbe has a few problems with it. We're going to see the Rebbe is not going to accept this premise that former overrides latter in Torah, at least not according to Pshat. Apparently there is such a concept in Torah, but the Rebbe says on the literal level of Torah study, which is Rashi's level, no, you cannot say that principle. And here's how the Rebbe approves that. We have examples in Torah in many places. The Rebbe is going to cite 2, where we see the opposite. The latter overrides the former. One is in last week's portion on the very same thing. Over there, Hashem is talking to Moshe as opposed to this week when Moshe is talking to the Jews. And Hashem tells Moshe, A, I want you to tell the Jews about building a temple and all the details. And B, by the way, keep Shabbos. And over there, the Torah says, and Rashi points out, but keep my Shabbos, which means Shabbos does not get desecrated, God forbid, for the Mishkan building. In fact, Shabbos takes precedence. So we're seeing the latter overrides the former. Another example, the Rebbe cites, that in the portion of Kedoshim it says, a man should fear or revere his father and mother and observe my Shabbos. I am your Hashem. So Rashi there says the same thing. And then here you say, it says, fear your parents, revere them, but observe Shabbos. So the latter overrides the former. Yeah, you have to revere your parents, but not at the expense of Shabbos. If your parents tell you that's great Shabbos, God forbid, you don't have to listen to them. And why? Because I am Hashem, your God, and both you and they are responsible to me. So here we have 2 examples off the bat where the latter overrides the former. So which one is it? The Rebbe says that the commentaries on Rashi deal with this problem. The commentaries on Rashi who argue that the message in our Rashi here in Vayakhel is that former overrides latter in Torah. How would they deal with the 2 examples that the Rebbe cites? They're bothered by the same question. But their response is that, in fact, normally former does override latter, which I guess is logical, right? It comes first, that means it takes precedence. In fact, the commentators will say former overrides latter, and that's what the Rashi is saying in our instance, in Vayakhel. However, those 2 examples cited are exceptions to the rule, and in those cases, the latter, in fact, overrides the former. But the reason is because the Torah goes out of its way to emphasize that this is an exception. So let's take a look at the examples. In last week's portion, it said, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, tell the Jews to build a Mishkan, etc., etc. And then it says, but My Shabbos you have to keep. And as Rashi himself says, Kol achin v'rakin miyutin. Anytime it says but or only, that means an exception. It says, but keep my Shabbos. That means keep the Mishkan, build the Mishkan, but there's an exception, not on Shabbos. So the commentators will say that but is an emphasis that changes the rule that normally former overrides latter. And that's why in that case, it'll be the opposite. Similarly, in Kedoshim, fear your father and mother, revere them, keep my Shabbos. I am Hashem, your God. Those last words, which Rashi cites as part of the message, the reason why Hashem's Shabbos overrides reverence to your parents is because I am Hashem, your God, in plural, that both you and your parents are responsible to honor me, and therefore my Shabbos overrides them. There too, there's a reason. The Torah states an emphasis of why in this case, the latter overrides the former, because the Torah emphasizes it with the word but, or I am Hashem the Lord. But normally, typically, say these Rashi commentaries, when there's just two mitzvahs, A before B, A does override B. But the Rebbe doesn't accept this. The Rebbe says that in the Pshat level, it does not accept this. And his argument is very simple. If the principle is that former overrides latter, aha! But in Kitisa and Kedoshim, we just cited examples where it's the opposite. Why would the latter override the former? Because the Torah went out of its way and had to add an emphasis. The emphasis of but and the emphasis of I am Hashem, your God. Just omit those emphases and reverse the order. So, for example, in last week's portion of Kitisa, why didn't Hashem first begin the parsha with Shabbos and then tell Hashem, tell Moshe Rabbeinu the mitzvah of building the Mishkan? And there's no need for the but. There's no need for emphasis. Stick with the principle that former overrides latter. And ditto that in Kedoshim. You could omit the words, I am Hashem, your God, and just reverse the verse. Observe Shabbos and fear your parents. So you know the former overrides the latter. Torah doesn't do that. So the Rebbe wants to argue that the principle is going to be that in Pshat level of Torah study, at least, there isn't such a thing as former versus latter. That former overrides latter. No. There is a concept that's brought very often that when two are juxtaposed, one next to the other, there's a connection. But there isn't such a principle that former overrides latter. And that's the reason why in last week's portion, as an example, the Torah could not have accomplished the message teaching us that you don't break Shabbos to build the Mishkan. Simply by putting Shabbos first, it wouldn't do the job. And that's why, in fact, it needs that nuanced emphasis. But, and the same thing in Kedoshim. So the question becomes, what is Rashi's intent in our portion? And that Rashi says, he prefaced to them that Shabbos goes first. What does prefacing have to do with anything? Remember, we just concluded that former does not override latter on the Pshat level. And we brought proofs from last week's portion and elsewhere. So therefore, we're back to square A. What's the purpose and what's the meaning of this Rashi? And besides, the Rebbe throws in a very important point, this law, this halacha, that Shabbos overrides temple building, and you can't build a temple on Shabbos, is already taught last week, as we just explored. So why do we need this verse to begin with? Why do we need this Rashi to begin with? Like, what is going on here? What is going on here? What's the purpose of what's Rashi trying to accomplish? And we're not accepting, says the Rebbe on the Pshat level, the approach of the commentaries on Rashi, that this is simply teaching us a principle of former overriding latter. The Rebbe does not accept that is a principle on the Pshat level, as he's proven. Okay, so the Rebbe says we need to understand what the purpose of this Rashi is and the message of this Rashi. It's problematic. Rashi emphasized, he prefaced to them, and we just pointed out and proved conclusively that it can't be about the prefacing. Plus, there's a question, why is this even needed? We already know this law from last week, so why did Rashi have to repeat it here? But in the process, the Rebbe says, let's take a step back, teaching the Sicha a little bit out of order. And let's take a look at this same message brought in last week's Torah portion, as we already touched upon. There's not one, but two Rashis there. So I'm going to number them here. You have 1, 2, and 3. 3 different Rashis related to the same message, namely, that Shabbos overrides Mishkan building. And we need to understand the purpose of each one. It's an interesting Sicha because we have a problem with a Rashi. But then the Rebbe steps back and creates a problem with 2 other Rashis in the previous Torah portion on the similar subject, on the same subject. And by resolving those, we resolve this. So, in last week's portion, again, over there, Hashem is speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not Moshe speaking to the Jews. Hashem is speaking to Moshe. He tells them a whole long thing about building the Mishkan. And then after that whole instruction, Hashem says to Moshe, and you speak to the Jews and tell them, but by Shabbos you got to keep. There's 2 Rashis on that little verse that I just read. And you speak to the Jews. Va'ata daber al bnei Yisrael. Says Rashi, although I appointed you to command them on the Mishkan, Shabbos should not be light in your eyes to be pushed aside. Okay. And then Rashi's not satisfied with that alone. In that same verse, when it says, ach, but my Shabbos shall be kept, says Rashi, although they'll be rushed and alacrity in the work, the Mishkan, Shabbos should not be pushed aside, because the rule is any but and only are exceptions. Whenever it says ach or rak, but or only, it's an exception, and therefore, ach hashabsosai, but keep my Shabbos, meaning to say, yes, don't do it on Shabbos. So we have 2 Rashis. And then, of course, we have the Rashi in this week's portion, which we already studied, that Moshe gathered the Jews in turn, and he told them what we just read, that he prefaced Shabbos to say that it doesn't override the Shabbos. So the Rebbe says, let's analyze like all 3 together. Again, I'm doing the Sicha slightly out of order, but I think it gives you a very clear picture of the 3 Rashis that are being discussed. Number 1, the Rebbe says, how does the word and you teach anything? Rashi is, when he gives a comment, he has a Dibra Maskell, he has an entry from the verse that he uses as the main header to the commentary. And that indicates where he derives the lesson from. In that case, Rashi number 1, the Dibra Maskell, the entry from the verse is, Va'ata tedaber al bnei Yisrael, and you speak to the Jews. Really? What does that teach? And what does Rashi say? That teaching us the law that don't let the Mishkan override Shabbos. How does that connect to the words? And you speak to the Jews. This is the Rebbe's type of question. Again, the words that Rashi selects from the verse, that's an indication of where he gets the message, at least where he gets it in pshat level. And you speak to the Jews, that's like par for the course. I mean, that's how Hashem talks to Moshe. Go tell the Jews. No, because he said, and you speak to the Jews, aha, there's something about Shabbos. Like, how is that verse exceptional? This is a strong question in Rebbe land, in taking Rashi serious. Next, why do we need both of these lessons? Why do we have 2 Rashis in the same pasuk? Pasuk says, you command the Jews that you have to keep my Shabbos, but keep my Shabbos. On that 8 words, Rashi has 2 entries. You command the Jews, but not to break Shabbos. But keep my Shabbos, but is an exception. Pick one or the other. Why do you need 2 limudim, 2 Rashis? Meaning there's 2 ways to learn from this verse the same message. Namely, not to break Shabbos with the building of the Mishkan. Very, very strange. Besides, as we said earlier, the first one doesn't seem to say anything. When the verse says, and you speak to the Jews, how is that teaching that they shouldn't break Shabbos? Like, what is it about? Then the Rebbe says, again in his signature style, the nuances between these 2 are fascinating. The nuances between the 2 Rashis. Let's take a look. First of all, the Rebbe has a general question. It's very, very wordy. It's very wordy. Let's look at the Rashis. Rashi number 1. Although I appointed you to command them on the Mishkan, Shabbos should not be light in your eyes to be pushed aside. Why did you just say it shouldn't be push away Shabbos? What's this thing with Shabbos should not be light in your eyes? And although I appointed you to command them on the Mishkan, the last time I checked, Moshe was appointed to command the Jews. Hello on everything. The whole Torah came through Moshe. What mitzvah was Moshe not appointed to command the Jews? So what is this? And although I appointed you to command them on the Mishkan, don't let Shabbos become light in your eyes. Moshe was appointed to command the Jews on all the Torah. So what are we saying here? And the next Rashi introduces a new concept. Now tell the Jews, but keep my Shabbos. Says Rashi, because they'll be rushed and alacritous. They're going to be rushing to build a Mishkan. Shabbos should not be pushed aside. Like, where does this come in from? Again, you don't need all the detail. You could just say, keep my Shabbos, which means Shabbos shouldn't be overridden. We don't need the whole long-winded thing about rushed and alacritous. Where does Rashi getting all this from? On the pshat level. While we're at it, look at the nuance in the third Rashi, our Rashi. He prefaced to them, doesn't just say he prefaced Shabbos, he prefaced to them. Okay. So the Rebbe is going to say like this. Let's go back to the main question of the Sicha. What's bothering Rashi? What's the purpose of this Rashi? What's the intent? And we already decided it's not what the other commentaries say to teach us that the former overrides the latter, because that's not true. So the Rebbe says Rashi is bothered by a very simple question. Why did Moshe reverse the order? Hashem told him a commandment last week. He told him Mishkan, then he told him Shabbos. And we already know why he told him Shabbos, to teach us the restriction. Don't break my Shabbos to build a Mishkan. Got it? Let's assume Moshe repeats it, so the Torah wants to repeat both of those messages, Mishkan and Shabbos. That's not a problem on the pshat level. Hashem said both. Moshe is going to repeat both. Not a problem. But why would Moshe reverse the order? Hashem told him first about Mishkan, then about Shabbos. When Moshe meets with the Jews and he gathers them and it's a whole big assembly, he says, and by the way, first I want to talk to you about Shabbos. And then he talks to them about the Mishkan. That's what's bothering Rashi. That's a problem. That's a problem. So the Rebbe now is going to analyze all the three Rashis. Let's take a look at the bottom of the screen, 1, 2, and 3. And the Rebbe is going to say, the Rashi is teaching us over here that each one of these messages is it's for another purpose. The first Rashi, Hashem is teaching Moshe Rabbeinu the actual law. The second Rashi, he's forewarning that the Jewish people should not, by accidentally, because of their excitement, override it. Let's explain. The verse begins, and you shall speak to the Jews. Hashem says to Moshe, which is a very unusual language. It very often says in Torah, speak to the Jews. But what's this? And you, va'ato, and you shall speak to the Jews. Aha! There's something exceptional here. And that is that this is a mitzvah that Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded personally to teach all the Jews in an assembly. Typically, Moshe didn't gather all the Jews and tell them everything. Moshe would teach Aaron, then he would teach Aaron and his sons, and then the elders would come in. Eventually, it would trickle down to the Jews. It's unusual that Moshe should do Vayakhel, Kol Hadas B'nai Yisrael, all the Jews. It's very unusual. It's only in a few places in the Torah. And this is one of them. So Rashi is pointing out, Hashem told Moshe with this exceptional word, Va'ato tedaber, you speak to the Jews, even though I'm instructing you, I'm pointing you, that you should personally command them about this mitzvah. So clearly this mitzvah is exceptional. Yes, you teach them all of Judaism, but all of Judaism, you teach to a small group and slowly it gets out. Here, you're teaching it to all the Jews. I appointed you to teach them. So clearly there's something very, very special and prominent about the Mishkan. So therefore, you, Moshe Rabbeinu, yourself may decide that Mishkan might override Shabbos. So in the first instance, in the first Rashi, the message of Rashi and the Torah is, Moshe, I want you to know the law. Don't let Shabbos be light in your eyes. Hence the detailed wordiness. Let Shabbos not be light in your eyes. You, Moshe Rabbeinu, the scholar, the tzaddik. Here's where Hashem is actually teaching them the halacha. That even though Mishkan is so important, that it's one of those rare exceptions where Moshe was told to teach it to all the Jews in an assembly. However, I don't want you to take Shabbos light. I want you to know the halacha that Shabbos is holy and everything else, and Mishkan is holy, etc., and it's important, but Shabbos overrides it. There's nothing to be taken lightly about Shabbos. So that's where he teaches them the basic law of the prohibition of overriding Shabbos for the Mishkan. Then the verse continues that you should tell the Jews, but you have to caution them. But is a cautioning. Here, this is not teaching us the law of whether or not you could break Shabbos to build a Mishkan. Here he's speaking to the fact that the Jewish people will be emotionally excited because they knew that the Mishkan is going to be atonement for the golden calf. They knew they were in big trouble with the golden calf, and they wanted very, very much to gain atonement as quickly as possible. And therefore, they're going to be rushed and alacrities, as we see happen in today's portion. They collected the money in a minute, and he had to tell them to stop the collection. There was a tremendous amount of excitement and passion in doing this work because they wanted to gain atonement. So here's another issue. The first Rashi is dealing with what's the law for Moshe's sake. Moshe doesn't have the emotional issue of being rushed and alacrities, primarily because Moshe didn't sin in the golden calf. He doesn't need the atonement. To Moshe, it's just an objective reality. Is it or is it not light in your eyes? What's the rule? And Hashem teaches him, no, it should not be light in your eyes, and it doesn't override it. But in the second Rashi, tell the Jews, but the Jews need a but. The way I'm understanding this is they need to set the brakes on because they're going to be excited. They're looking for atonement. And they know that they really messed up in Hashem's eyes. So they want to put that Mishkan up quick. You're going to stop on Shabbos. Let's keep on going. Therefore, the Torah is teaching him. Tell the Jews to be very, very careful that they shouldn't accidentally break the Shabbos. This is not a fear that they're actually going to do it on purpose because the Jews know that they have to listen to Moshe's rules. They don't make up the rules. But this is going to be an accidental. It's going to be an inadvertent mistake. And why? Because they're rushed and alacritous. We all know when you're in the middle of a project and you rush, you didn't look at the watch, and et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, there's two Rashis based on two nuances in the verse. One nuance, and you speak to the Jews, and one nuance, but it's two different things. In those few words, the Torah and therefore Rashi is giving us two different lessons. Lesson one, again, is the actual objective law taught to Moshe, that in fact Shabbos overrides the Mishkan. And why would that need to be stated? Because the Mishkan is an exceptional mitzvah that was told to Moshe that he should command all the Jews in the collective, and that's an unusual thing. And therefore Moshe is told, no, it's wonderful, but not to override Shabbos. That's the actual halacha. In the second instance, the Torah and Rashi therefore are teaching Moshe to point out to the Jews to be extra careful. They shouldn't inadvertently override Shabbos. And this will be not because they're going to make their own ruling. They don't make their own rulings. They listen to Moshe Rabbeinu. But they're just so rushed and so excited, and et cetera, et cetera. We all understand this. You're busy with a project, and by accident, you didn't look at the clock or what have you. And that is a caution of inadvertently. And therefore, number one and two have very, very different purposes and missions. And therefore they're written at great length. There's two limudim, there's two nuances, the nuance of and you and the nuance of but. One is speaking to Moshe, one is speaking to the Jews through Moshe. One is teaching the objective law, one is teaching the emotional caution not to inadvertently break it. Hence all of the wordiness of these Rashis. If you think about it, this is like a perfection. Two long Rashis, and the Rebbe shows her every single word of it. In fact, look in Rashi 1, it says it shouldn't be light in your eyes, speaking to Moshe, as the lawgiver. Don't let this be light in your eyes in the sense that that you should think that it has lightness compared to the importance of the Mishkan, which I appointed you to teach the Jews collectively, etc., etc. Whereas in the second Rashi, it's speaking to them. It's fantastic nuance, a fantastic diuk that the Rebbe points out. It's speaking to them, although they will be rushed. It doesn't say you will be rushed, because again, Moshe is not really rushed on the Mishkan. Moshe didn't sin with the golden calf. In fact, it is said that Moshe really didn't build any part of the Mishkan. It's not his thing. He's just the instructor here. And that's the second part. You need to know the law, that's number one. But number two, tell the Jews to be very careful. Tell them, but be very careful, because you're going to be all excited and you might mess up because of your excitement. So that's the two Rashis there. There's nothing extra. There's nothing extra. Now that we understand that, Rashi 3 rides on the coattails of Rashi 2. And that is, so now Moshe comes to the Jews. He knows the halacha. The Shabbos overrides the Mishkan. So in order to teach him that halacha, he should have put Shabbos, I guess, at the end, just the way Hashem did it. Because the main discussion is the Mishkan. Then the Shabbos at the end will be the PS that don't break it. Moshe decides to reverse it and put Shabbos first. Why? Because of the second Rashi, because of the second lesson in Kitisa. Namely, that Hashem told Moshe, you're going to need to caution the Jews because they're going to be very excited about this. They're trying to get their atonement. This is not just about teaching them the halacha. This is a case, they did a golden calf and they feel terrible. They did it with alacrity and they're going to do this with alacrity. They're going to rush. They're going to be, zrizin rodufim, rushed and etc. So Moshe realizes he really has to emphasize this. It's not just about giving them the information, the data. It's about cautioning them with red flags. Therefore, Moshe gathers all the Jews. Everybody comes. And they're expecting to hear something new. And there's rumors, right, that Moshe's going to tell them a new mitzvah with a temple, and it's going to be a mishkan and a collection. They're all excited. We're going to get atonement. Says Moshe, I want you to know there's a mitzvah of Shabbos. People looking at each other. We know that already. We heard it on Sinai. We even heard it before Sinai. Moshe starts at first to make the point that I'm just telling you, Shabbos is number one in Yiddishkeit. Be very careful, because I'm now going to give you another mitzvah which you're going to be very excited about. Don't let it inadvertently override Shabbos. Shabbos always remains predominant, and therefore I put it first. Again, not for informational purposes, in which case it could have been last, but for, let's call it cautionary purposes, emphasis purposes. When you take your kids to an amusement park, right? And you're telling them to be careful that they should stay in pairs, they shouldn't walk alone. So there's two types of parenting, depending on how the kids are behaving. One parent says, here, go have fun, here's your rules, here's your tickets, here's your lunch. And by the way, don't let anybody, don't talk to strangers, or don't go alone, or etc. But if you have, if you're more of a worried parent, or if your kid is the wild type or whatever, conducive to getting into trouble, you might start before anything else. Number one, don't do this and don't do that, etc., etc. And now we're going to talk about what you could do. We went to summer camp. The first speech of the head counselor was, no one's allowed to leave the ground. That was the first hello, before he told you who your counselor is, before he told you where your bunk is, before he told you anything. He told you, don't ever leave campgrounds because that's dangerous. So by making that the first thing, it became emphasized, because later when you get busy with the activity, you forget about it. Don't ever forget about it. It's number one. So that's how I think how the Rebbe is reading this pasuk, that Moshe Rabbeinu gathers the Jews, and what's the first thing he says to them? Something they already know. And that's because he's trying to make, he's following Hashem's command to teach the Jews not just the objective law, but the emotional caution of not allowing it to be desecrated even inadvertently. And therefore the language in that Rashi is, Moshe prefaced to them. There's so much diuk. Every Rashi here, the way the Rebbe reads it, is precise. Every one of the three Rashis. He prefaced to them the Shabbos restriction, not he prefaced Shabbos. Shabbos wasn't prefaced in the last week's portion. It came after. The same difference. You don't have to preface it to give the message. We already learned that. When he came to giving it to them, he prefaced it first to bring home this cautionary protection, so that the Jews don't inadvertently mess it up. And the Rebbe also says that's the language to say, lomar, to say that it doesn't override Shabbos. The Rebbe says it doesn't mean like normally, like lamedcha, to teach. That he put Shabbos first to teach, like the other commentaries would say, because the former overrides the latter. No, to teach it, we already know from last week's portion. This is to say, to bring home to the Yidden the importance of this message, not to teach them this law, but to say, listen here, buddy, this is really important. And that's all the Rashis fall into place.